The wind had teeth in this country. Elias Thorne felt them bite through the worn wool of his coat as he crested the shale ridge. Below, the pronghorn buck limped, its left foreleg stained a dark, glistening crimson against the pale dust. A clean shot, but not a final one. The Winchester in his hands felt cold, a familiar weight against his shoulder. He worked the lever, the smooth, oiled schlick-schlack of the action, a mechanical counterpoint to the rising howl of the wind. Dust devils danced on the plains, skeletal and gray, harbingers of the storm clawing its way over the distant Dragoon Mountains. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise. He had an hour, maybe less. Thorne moved, not with haste, but with a relentless economy of motion. His boots slid on the loose scree, dislodging a cascade of small stones that rattled into the silence. He froze, his body a study in stillness, but the buck was too far gone in its own pain to notice. He flowed down the incline, his path a calculated negotiation with the treacherous terrain. Every rock, every twisted juniper, was a piece of a puzzle he solved without thought. He read the land as other men read books. The buck stumbled again, its head low. Thorne raised the rifle, the iron sights framing the animal's desperate flight. He led it by a hair, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot was sharp, almost instantly swallowed by the immense, waiting silence of the high desert. The pronghorn collapsed, a heap of tan and white fur on the gray earth. There was no triumph in it, only the grim satisfaction of survival. The storm was closer now, a churning wall of ochre dust that blotted out the sun. He worked quickly, his knife a blur of efficient expertise. The hide came away with practiced pulls. The meat was sectioned with a butcher's precision. He packed the best cuts in oilcloth, the movements swift and sure, his mind already 3 steps ahead. Shelter, water, fire. He lashed the meat to his saddle, his dun gelding shifting nervously as the air grew thick and heavy with grit. The first stinging grains of sand whipped against his face. He pulled his hat low and turned the horse toward a shallow rock overhang he'd marked earlier. A dark slash in a sandstone cliff. It wasn't a cave, but it would have to do. As he settled in, the full fury of the dust storm hit, a screaming, blinding maelstrom that scoured the world clean. The sun vanished. The air was thick enough to chew. He checked his canteen half full. He had meat. He would endure. The land tested you, always. It stripped you down to bone and will. Thorne had been stripped down a long time ago. What was left was a man who knew how to wait, how to watch, and how to survive what came next. The wind howled its agreement, a long, mournful cry across the empty plains. The storm broke near midnight, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and unnaturally silent under a canopy of cold, indifferent stars. Thorne had a small fire going, a smokeless handful of juniper wood tucked deep in the overhang. The smell of roasting meat was a small comfort in the vast emptiness. He was checking the wrap on his gelding's foreleg when he heard it, the exhausted, stumbling gait of a horse pushed past its limits. He moved to the edge of the shelter, his hand resting on the colt at his hip. A lone rider emerged from the darkness, a silhouette against the star-dusted horizon. The horse, a fine-boned mare, was lathered and trembling, its head hung low. The rider slid from the saddle less like a dismount and more like a controlled fall. It was a woman, her face pale and streaked with dust in the flickering firelight. She carried a leather-bound journal clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes, wide and hunted, found his. They were dark, and they held no plea for pity, only a raw, desperate assessment. "They said I could find a man out here who knows the passes," she said, her voice rough but steady. "A man who doesn't ride with a brand or answer to a badge." Thorne didn't move. He watched the back trail, the long, dark expanse from which she'd come. "Who's they?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. "My husband," she said, and the word hung in the air, heavy with fresh loss. Before Silas Corrigan killed him, the name landed like a stone. Corrigan, a man who bought land with rumor and held it with bullets. He ran a small army of hard men who flew his flag, a black banner with a coiled serpent. Corrigan's warlord, Thorne murmured, a statement, not a question. He took my husband's map, the woman continued, her gaze unwavering. A survey for the railroad. It shows every hidden spring and year-round water source in this territory. The key to controlling everything. She held up the journal. But he doesn't have this. My husband's log, it's coded. The map is useless without it. Thorne could feel the closing jaws of the trap. This wasn't his fight. He owed no one. What do you want from me? Passage. To the federal marshal in Prescott. They're only a day behind me. She followed his gaze to the horizon, where a faint, almost imperceptible plume of dust was rising against the stars. They'll be here by sunrise. She took a breath, a final gamble. She looked him square in the eye, the firelight catching the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. Her words were not a bargain, but a creed spoken in the face of annihilation. If you protect me tonight, I'll ride beside you at dawn, said the widow to the cowboy. Thorne looked from her determined face to the dust on the horizon, then back. He saw the truth of her peril, the steel in her spine. He gave a single, sharp nod. Get your horse under the rock, he said, turning to kick dirt over the fire. They'll see the light. His world of calculated isolation had just ended. The dun and the mare moved as one, their hooves muffled by the sandy soil of the arroyo floor. Thorne led, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, reading the subtle shifts in shadow and light. Lena Caldwell rode beside him, her face set, the journal now tucked inside her coat. They had left the line shack moments before Corrigan's outriders crested the hill, a pack of dark figures against the blood-red smear of dawn. There was no time for a plan, only for movement. Thorne pushed them hard, using his intimate knowledge of the broken land to their advantage. He led them through a maze of narrow canyons, the sandstone walls rising hundreds of feet on either side, so close in places he could touch both sides at once. The echo of their passage was swallowed by the stone. He'll send men to the canyon mouth, Lena said, her voice tight, cutting through the rhythmic clopping of hooves. He'll expect us to follow the water. We won't, Thorne replied, his gaze fixed on a fissure in the canyon wall ahead, a crack barely wide enough for a horse. He guided his gelding into the opening, the animal's sides scraping against the rock. Lena followed without question. The fissure opened into a game trail, a treacherous path that switchbacked up the side of the mesa. Below, the canyon floor stretched out like a map. Minutes later, they saw them, 5 of Corrigan's riders, thundering past the fissure, heading for the canyon's end, a trap neatly avoided. From their vantage point, Thorne watched the riders. He saw their frustration when they found the canyon empty, saw the lead rider, a burly man with a cruel face, gesture back the way they came. They weren't fools. They would backtrack. We bought time, not distance, Thorne said, urging his horse onward. The trail was steep and littered with loose rock. The sun beat down, a physical weight. The chase resumed on the high plain, a desperate, lung-searing gallop across sun-baked earth. The riders were on them again, fanning out to cut off any chance of escape. A rifle cracked, the bullet whining past Thorne's ear with a sound like a furious insect. He didn't return fire. A running gunfight was a fool's game. Instead, he veered sharply, guiding them toward a field of hoodoos, stone pillars carved by centuries of wind and rain. They weaved through the labyrinth of rock, the sounds of pursuit echoing strangely. Another shot ricocheted off a spire, spraying them with stone chips. Thorne pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Keep moving. He yelled. He reined in behind a thick column of rock, slid from the saddle, and rested the Winchester on a weathered ledge. He wasn't aiming for a kill, but for a disruption. He tracked the lead rider, exhaled, and fired. The man's horse screamed and went down, a tangle of flailing legs, sending another rider careening into it. Chaos. It was the opening they needed. He was back in the saddle before the dust settled, pushing them through the last of the rock formations and out onto the open plain again. They had gained another precious half-mile, but the cost was high. The mare, a fine animal but not bred for this punishing terrain, was flagging. A dark stain spread across her flank. A ricochet had torn a shallow gash. Their pursuers were fewer, but they were still coming. Thorne looked at their dwindling water supply, the heaving sides of the horses, and the endless shimmering horizon. The first setback. The game had just begun. They rode until the horses were on the verge of collapse, the sun a merciless hammer overhead. The landscape shifted from broken plains to the skeletal remains of an old mining operation. Rusted ore carts lay on their sides like dead beetles, and the gaunt frameworks of headrigs clawed at the sky. A sign, its letters faded to ghosts, read, "Dust Devil's Luck." According to Lena's husband, a man named Jedediah Stone ran the assay office and held a deep-seated grudge against Corrigan. He was supposed to be their one reliable ally. The camp was quiet, too quiet. No smoke rose from the single stone chimney of the office. No sound of pick or hammer. A carrion crow circled lazily overhead, a black speck in an ocean of blue. Thorne felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He dismounted 100 yards out, pulling the horses behind a slag heap. "Stay here," he ordered Lena, his voice low. "Something's wrong." He moved toward the office, his Winchester held at a low ready, using the derelict structures for cover. The place felt like a tomb. The door to the assay office was slightly ajar. He nudged it open with the rifle barrel. Inside, the room was a wreck. Papers were strewn across the floor, furniture overturned. Jedediah Stone was there, slumped over his desk, a single dark hole in the center of his chest. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Thorne's gaze swept the room, taking in the details with cold, tactical clarity. A half-empty bottle of whiskey. 2 glasses on the desk. This wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Betrayal. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Thorne spun, bringing the rifle up, but it was too late. A figure appeared at the top of the stairs, the burly rider from the canyon, a smug grin on his face. "Pathfinder," the man drawled. "Graves said you'd be smart enough to find your way here." The sharp crack of a rifle from outside shattered the window next to Thorne's head, spraying him with glass. He dove behind the heavy oak desk as more shots punched through the thin walls of the office. They were surrounded. He was pinned. He risked a glance out the shattered window. He could see at least 6 of them, using the mining equipment and slag heaps as fortified positions. Corrigan hadn't just predicted their move. He'd turned their sanctuary into a kill box. The siege had begun. "Lena," he yelled, his voice raw. "The dynamite shed. West side of the camp." He saw a flicker of movement as she darted from behind the slag heap, running low and fast toward a small, dilapidated shack. Bullets kicked up dust at her heels, but she made it, disappearing inside. Thorne fired 2 quick shots at the riflemen, forcing them to take cover, giving her a precious few seconds. Now they were separated, trapped in a carefully laid snare. The terrain he used so expertly was now their prison. Their options had narrowed to one desperate, explosive gambit. The midday sun beat down on the tin roof, turning the office into an oven. The ticking clock wasn't a deadline anymore. It was the slow, agonizing drip of water from his punctured canteen. The heat in the assay office was suffocating. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight, piercing the bullet-riddled walls. Thorne lay flat behind the overturned desk, the wood groaning as another slug slammed into it. Outside, Corrigan's men were patient. They had shade, water, and overwhelming numbers. He and Lena had a crumbling building, a few dozen rounds of ammunition, and a desperate idea. A muffled scraping sound came from beneath the floorboards. Thorne pressed his ear to the dusty wood. Patter, scrape, pause, scrape, scrape. It was her. The signal they'd agreed upon if they were separated. He scraped back with the butt of his knife. 1. Pause. 2-1. She was in the mine tunnels that honeycombed the ground beneath the camp, just as they'd hoped. Jedediah's notes, which Lena had read on the ride, mentioned the tunnels connected the main shaft to a storm cellar beneath the assay office. It was their only way out. Thorne risked a look through a crack in the wall. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple. Corrigan himself was there now, a tall, imposing figure standing beside the main headrig, directing his men with quiet authority. Thorne saw him consult a pocket watch. He was on a schedule, the meeting with the railroad agent. That was their ticking clock. They had to be out of this trap and on the trail before morning. He crawled to the back of the office, where a heavy iron trapdoor led to the cellar. It was bolted from his side, but rusted tight. He used his rifle butt as a lever, grunting with the effort, the muscles in his back and shoulders screaming in protest. With a groan of tortured metal, the bolt gave way. He pulled the door open, revealing a black, musty-smelling square. He could hear Lena more clearly now, working on the other side of the cellar wall. He began pulling loose stones from the foundation, his fingers raw and bleeding. The plan was simple and insane. Lena, using the dynamite she'd retrieved from the shed, would rig a charge on the main support beam of the headrig above the primary mine shaft. He would provide the diversion. Once the charge was set, she would join him in the cellar. They would blow the headrig, collapsing the main shaft, and with any luck, half the camp along with it. The ensuing chaos would be their only cover to escape through the tunnels. He counted his remaining cartridges. 12 for the rifle, 6 in the Colt. Not enough for a sustained fight, but plenty for a loud distraction. He waited, his body coiled like a spring, listening to the slow, steady work of Lena dismantling the cellar wall. Each scrape of stone was a tick of their dwindling clock. Finally, a small hole appeared, then another, until Lena's dust-streaked face peered through. "It's set," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "A 10-minute fuse." He helped her through the opening. She was exhausted, but her eyes burned with a resolute fire. She clutched a second, smaller bundle of dynamite sticks. "For surprises," she explained. He nodded, checking the cap-and-ball pistol from Jedediah's desk he'd found. An old, unreliable weapon, but it was another 6 shots. "Get to the secondary airshaft, the one that opens to the east," he instructed. "Don't wait for me. We leave together," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. "If I fall, you ride," he countered, echoing a creed as old as the frontier itself. "The journal is the mission." Before she could reply, a volley of shots tore through the front of the office. Corrigan was done waiting. The assault was beginning. "Light the fuse," Thorne said, his voice grim. "It's time to get loud." Lena scrambled down into the darkness of the mine tunnel, the lit fuse of the smaller dynamite bundle fizzing in her hand. Thorne provided cover, firing methodical, well-aimed shots from the cellar opening, forcing Corrigan's men to keep their heads down. The main assault faltered as they were hit from an unexpected angle. He saw Lena toss the bundle toward a stack of old barrels near the camp's entrance before disappearing into the tunnel. A moment later, a deafening blast ripped through the air, sending barrels and bodies flying. It was the diversion they needed. Thorne dropped into the cellar, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the 10-minute fuse on the main charge reached its destination. The world erupted in a cataclysmic roar. The entire assay office shuddered, the ground heaving beneath them. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Above them, the massive headrig groaned, twisted, and then collapsed into the mouth of the main shaft, with a sound like the world tearing in half. A cloud of thick, choking dust filled the air. The gauntlet had begun. Thorne lit a small lantern, its feeble glow pushing back the oppressive subterranean darkness. The tunnel was narrow and braced with rotting timbers. The air was stale, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. "This way," Lena said, her voice strained but certain. She consulted the journal, its pages filled with her husband's precise, spidery script. He had mapped this place. It was their only advantage. They moved deeper into the earth, the sounds of shouting and chaos from the camp above slowly fading. The tunnel forked. Lena paused, running her fingers over the rock wall. "Here," she said, pointing to a set of markings almost invisible in the gloom. He marked a weak wall. "It leads to the older workings." The path was treacherous. They waded through knee-deep, stagnant water that chilled them to the bone. At one point, a section of the roof gave way behind them, sealing the tunnel and cutting off any chance of retreat. There was only forward. The air grew thinner, and the lantern flame flickered, starved of oxygen. They came to a vertical shaft, a black pit that dropped into nothingness. A series of rusted iron rungs were hammered into the rock wall, slick with moisture. "The air shaft is on the other side of this," Lena said, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's the only way." Thorne went first, the lantern hooked to his belt, its light swinging wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Each rung groaned under his weight. His fingers, raw and numb with cold, fought for purchase on the corroded metal. He felt a rung shift under his boot, and his heart leaped into his throat. He held on, his muscles screaming, until he found a secure foothold. He reached the bottom and looked up, a small circle of light in the immense darkness. "Come on," he called, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Lena followed, her movements careful and deliberate. As she neared the bottom, her foot slipped. She cried out, her body swinging out over the abyss. Thorne reacted instantly, lunging forward and grabbing her by the arm, his grip like a vice. He pulled her to safety, her body trembling against his. They stood for a moment in the silence of the deep earth, the shared peril forging their alliance into something stronger than steel. They pushed on, finally reaching the air shaft. A faint glimmer of moonlight filtered down from above. They had made it through the gauntlet. They emerged onto a narrow ledge on the face of a sheer cliff, the wind whipping at them, cold and clean. Below, the remains of Dust Devil's luck were a chaotic mess of fire and shadow. They were free. But Corrigan was still out there, and Prescott was still a long, hard ride away. The ghost town of Solitude clung to the edge of a high mesa, its weathered gray buildings like tombstones against the bruised twilight sky. It was a place of endings, forgotten by all with the wind. According to the cartographer's journal, a hidden, winding trail, the Angel's Staircase, was the only approach from the east, a path known to almost no one. It was their last, desperate advantage. They'd ridden hard, bypassing the main trails, their horses running on pure will. Below them, in the valley, they could see the dust cloud of Corrigan's main force making its slow, deliberate way toward the town's only conventional entrance, a narrow pass choked with rock. Thorne and Lena watched from a rocky outcrop, the wind tearing at their clothes. Corrigan was meeting the railroad agent here, at this remote, defensible location, to make the exchange. "He'll have sentries at the pass," Thorne said, his voice a low growl. "We can't fight our way in." "We don't have to," Lena replied. She pointed to a section of the journal. Her husband had been meticulous. He hadn't just mapped the water. He'd mapped the geology. "The rock here is unstable. Heavy rains last spring created a fracture. A plan formed in the space between them, a shared, unspoken understanding, born of desperation and ingenuity. They wouldn't lay a siege." They would become the terrain. They would use the town itself as a weapon. They tethered the horses and made their way on foot to the cliffs, overlooking the narrow pass. Below, 2 of Corrigan's men stood guard, their rifles glinting in the last of the sun's light. Using their lariats, Thorne and Lena worked together, dislodging key boulders at the top of the rockslide area her husband had noted. It was grueling, dangerous work. The rocks were heavy, their balance precarious. A single misplaced step would send them plummeting into the canyon below. Finally, it was ready. A cascade of rock and earth held back by a single teetering keystone boulder. They waited. The sound of approaching horses carried on the wind. Corrigan and a small honor guard of 4 men rode into the pass, leaving the bulk of their forces behind. Just as the journal predicted, he was arrogant, confident in his control of the situation. Thorne gave Lena a nod. Together, they put their shoulders to a long dead log, using it as a lever against the keystone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding groan, the rock shifted. It tipped, hung for a heart-stopping second, and then plunged downward. The landslide was an avalanche of sound and fury. Boulders the size of wagons crashed down into the pass, shaking the very foundations of the mesa. It happened in seconds. When the dust began to settle, the pass was completely blocked by a mountain of rock and debris. Corrigan and his 4 men were trapped on the Solitude side, cut off from their army. The warlord had just become a prisoner in his own fortress. Thorne looked at Lena, her face grim and determined in the fading light. They hadn't fired a shot, but they had just turned the tables. The showdown was no longer a battle against an army. It was a tactical hunt in a ghost town. And the hunters were now the hunted. The main street of Solitude was a corridor of ghosts. Moonlight silvered the warped wood of the saloon, the shattered glass of the land office. Wind moaned through the gaps in the buildings, a mournful, lonely sound. Corrigan and his men were somewhere in the shadows, waiting. Thorne and Lena moved like specters, slipping from the deep darkness of one derelict building to the next. This wasn't a gunfight. It was a chess match played with bullets and terrain. "He'll head for the highest ground," Thorne whispered, his breath pluming in the cold night air. The old hotel, 2 stories, clear lines of sight. "His men will cover the street from the livery and the blacksmith's," Lena added. Her knowledge of Corrigan's tactical mind, gleaned from her husband's fearful notes, proving invaluable. "He always protects his flanks." They separated, a silent agreement passing between them. He would take the direct approach, drawing their fire, becoming the target. She would circle around, using the interconnected back alleys and collapsed structures to get to the hotel from behind. Thorne stepped into the moonlit street, a deliberate, calculated risk. A rifle flashed from the dark maw of the livery. The shot went wide, the boom echoing off the silent facades. Thorne dove behind a rusted water trough, the metal ringing as another bullet slammed into it. He fired back, not at the muzzle flash, but at the roofline above it, sending a shower of dry-rotted shingles down on the gunman. It was enough to make him hesitate. From the blacksmith shop across the street, another of Corrigan's men opened fire. Thorne was pinned. This was the moment. He saw a flicker of movement in the second-story window of the hotel. Corrigan himself, watching the fight unfold, directing his men. As the warlord leaned out to shout an order, a lantern swung into view from the alley behind the hotel. It traced a slow, deliberate arc Lena's signal. Thorne emptied his Colt at the 2 gunmen, the rapid-fire explosions a deafening roar in the enclosed street. The fusillade forced them to duck back, giving Lena the opening she needed. The lantern she'd lit and rigged to a rope swung forward and crashed through the hotel window behind Corrigan. The room was instantly filled with a bright, flickering glow. The warlord was silhouetted, a perfect target against the sudden light. He spun around, startled, distracted for a critical second. It was all Thorne needed. He broke from cover, running low and fast, firing his last 2 rifle rounds at the hotel's balcony supports. The old wood splintered, groaned, and gave way. The entire balcony collapsed, sending a stunned Corrigan tumbling down into the dusty street below. He landed hard, his rifle clattering away into the darkness. His 2 remaining men, their attention now on their fallen leader, were exposed. Thorne dealt with the man in the livery with a single precise shot. The other threw down his weapon and fled into the night. Silence descended once more on Solitude. Thorne approached the groaning, dust-covered figure of Silas Corrigan. The warlord looked up, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. Before he could speak, the barrel of Thorne's Winchester settled between his eyes. The fight was over, not with a blaze of glory, but with a clever plan, a swung lantern, and a deep understanding of the enemy. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, they saw a lone rider approaching the blocked pass, the railroad agent. He had arrived to find his would-be partner bound and defeated, the true map and the coded journal resting safely in the hands of a widow who refused to be broken. The ride away from Solitude was quiet, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the tired plodding of the horses. Corrigan and his remaining men were trussed and in the custody of the railroad agent and his security team, who had looked at the landslide, the captured warlord, and the quiet determination of the widow with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The high desert air was cool and clean, washing away the dust and gunpowder, but not the memory of the ordeal. Thorne rode with his shoulders slumped. A deep weariness settled into his bones. The wounds were minor, a rope burned on his hands, a shallow graze on his arm, but the cost felt heavier. He watched Lena, who rode beside him, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had not spoken much since the confrontation, her silence filled with the weight of her loss and the grim satisfaction of justice served. They made camp as dusk fell, a small fire pushing back the immense, star-dusted darkness. Lena tended to the gash on Thorne's arm, her movements efficient and gentle. "My husband. He used to say you could measure a person not by how they act in the light, but by what they do when they think no one is watching," she said, her voice soft. Thorne grunted, watching the flames. "He was a good man." "He was," she agreed. "He believed in this land, not just as something to be owned, but as a place for families, for a future." She finished tying the bandage and looked at him, her eyes searching his in the firelight. "The railroad agent paid you, the full amount I promised." Thorne nodded. The heavy pouch of gold coins was in his saddlebag, a tangible end to the contract. But it felt different from other payments. Less like a wage, more like a share. A debt had been settled, not just for Lena, but for the memory of the man she'd lost. He realized he hadn't thought about his own solitary future once during the chase. His world had been consumed by the next step, the next ridgeline, the next tactical choice. He had been part of a we, a unit of 2 against the world. "Thank you, Elias," she said, using his first name for the first time. "You did more than guide me. You stood with me." He met her gaze, the terse, tactical language they had shared on the trail falling away, leaving something quieter, more profound in its place. "You rode beside me," he replied, the words a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of a blood oath. The fire crackled, and the silence that followed was not empty, but filled with an unspoken understanding. The wounds were tended, the debts were paid. The trail had taken its toll, but it had also forged something new in the crucible of its peril. They pushed on toward Prescott, the pace easier now, the constant threat of pursuit replaced by a shared, forward-looking purpose. The landscape softened from jagged rock and arid plains to rolling hills dotted with pinyon and juniper. They were re-entering the world of men, of laws and society, and it felt foreign after the raw clarity of the wilderness. One evening, camped beneath a canopy of ponderosa pines, Lena finally shared the full contents of the journal. It wasn't just a coded key to the map. It was a diary, a record of her husband's hopes and fears. He wrote of his dream for the territory, a place where small ranchers and homesteaders could thrive, their future secured by the equitable distribution of the water sources he had so carefully mapped. He had documented Corrigan's systematic campaign of intimidation and violence, the way he was illegally buying up land claims from desperate families, using the threat of thirst as his primary weapon. He wasn't just making a map for the railroad, Lena explained, her voice thick with emotion as she read a passage aloud. He was creating a charter, a legal claim for the homesteaders. He was going to present it to the federal marshal as evidence against Corrigan and as a petition for land grants. This revelation reframed everything. Lena's quest hadn't been solely for revenge or justice for one man, but for the survival of an entire community. She was not just a widow seeking retribution. She was a catalyst for a new future. Thorne listened, the weight of his actions settling upon him in a new way. He had taken the job for gold, a simple transactional agreement. But along the way, the mission had become something more. He had fought for Lena, for their shared survival. Now, he understood he had also been fighting for the faceless families her husband had died trying to protect. He looked at the fire, at the determined set of Lena's jaw as she read, and felt a profound shift within himself. The isolation he had cultivated for so long, the detached pragmatism that had kept him alive, now felt like a cage. He had been a pathfinder, a man who navigated the physical terrain. But Lena, and the legacy of her husband, had shown him a different kind of map, one that led not to a place, but to a purpose. The truth, revealed under the quiet watch of the stars, was that their victory in solitude was not an ending. It was the beginning of a much larger fight. And for the first time in a long time, Elias Thorne felt like he was on the right side of it. Prescott rose from the valley floor, a sprawling collection of raw lumber and hopeful ambition. The sight of it, the smoke rising from 100 chimneys, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, felt jarringly civilized. They rode down the main street, drawing curious glances from townsfolk. They were a hard-looking pair, covered in the dust and grime of the trail, their clothes torn, their faces etched with exhaustion and a grim resolve that set them apart. The federal marshal's office was a sturdy brick building, a symbol of the order they had fought so hard to reach. Marshal Thompson was a stout man with weary eyes that had seen too much. He listened to their story in silence, his expression unreadable, occasionally glancing from Lena's impassioned testimony to Thorne's quiet, stoic presence. He examined the map, the journal, and the signed confession from the railroad agent. When Lena finished, he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the quiet room. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you and your husband have done this territory a great service. This evidence will not only hang Silas Corrigan, but it will secure the water rights for every homesteader in the Verde Valley." The ordeal was over. The words should have brought a sense of relief, but Thorne felt a strange hollowness. The single-minded focus that had driven him for days was gone, replaced by an uncertain quiet. He had completed his mission. He was free. He watched as Lena worked with the marshal, her words sharp and precise, ensuring the legal framework was in place to protect the families her husband had championed. She was no longer just the catalyst. She had become the leader. The woman who had stumbled out of the darkness, seeking a guide, was now confidently charting the future of a community. Thorne stood by the window, looking out at the bustling street. He saw men going about their business, living lives he couldn't imagine, lives tied to one place, to other people. For years, he had defined himself by his ability to move through the world alone, untethered. He was the pathfinder, a man who always knew the way, but never had a destination. Now, standing in that office, he felt a different kind of lost. The trail had changed him. The isolated survivor who had taken shelter from a storm was gone, transformed by the fire of the chase and the steel of the woman who rode beside him. The next morning, Thorne packed his saddlebags. The dun gelding was rested, fed, and ready for the trail. He had his pay, his gear, and the open horizon calling to him as it always had. He found Lena by the town well, watching the sunrise paint the sky. She looked different here, away from the dust and the danger, but the same unyielding strength was in her eyes. "You're riding on," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's what I do," he replied, the old words feeling hollow on his tongue. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the bond forged in peril needing no words. "The marshal is deputizing a group to deliver the land grants," she said, her gaze steady on his. "Making sure they're honored. Corrigan still has friends, men who will try to undo what we've done." Thorne looked past the edge of town to the vast, wild country that had been his only home. He could disappear into it, be the ghost he had always been. The thought held no comfort. It felt like a retreat. The pathfinder who had started this journey would have taken the gold and vanished without a second thought. But he was not that man anymore. He had seen the cost of men like Corrigan and the courage of people like Lena and her husband. To ride away now would be to turn his back on the purpose he had stumbled into. He looked from the open country back to Lena, to the town, to the future she was fighting for. The land was the same, but he was not. His trail no longer led away from everything, but toward something. "A lawman's work isn't my line," he said slowly, "but a guide might be useful. To make sure they find the right springs." A slow smile spread across Lena's face, a sunrise all its own. "The trail will be dangerous," she warned, though there was no real warning in her tone, only an invitation. Thorne met her smile with a ghost of one of his own. He thought of the journey they had taken, the trust they had earned, the horizon they now shared. He gave a single, decisive nod. "I know the way," he said. And together they turned to face the dawn.